give a lecture. He's a noted authority on the psychology of giftedness, and he's currently the professor at the Department of Educational Psychology and Learning Systems at the State University of Florida. He was also executive director of Duke University's internationally renowned gifted program. So I guess the critical question today is, how do you raise a successful child? And Professor Pfeiffer will be sharing with us today his knowledge and experience on holistic child development, nurturing both strengths of their kids as well as strengths of their hearts. So please join me now together in welcoming Steve.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay in the back? We're good? Okay. Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's really wonderful to see you all here tonight, and I feel very privileged to be speaking in front of this group of what I assume are parents, and maybe some parents-to-be, and perhaps some aunts and uncles and grandparents as well. This is my most favorite group to speak with, and I hope in the short presentation that I'm planning to give today, I'll be able to share with you some ideas that you find useful that you may be able to apply in raising your son or daughter. That's my hope. In being invited to speak here, I was clear that based on my experience, I find that the question and answer period is perhaps the most profoundly useful. So we're going to have a fair amount of time where there'll be questions and answers. Okay, so I'm not going to be here lecturing on and on. I'm going to cover a few what I consider key points in raising a child successfully, and then open it up for questions and answers. And there's a number of very good books written for parents and the public on emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is a crucial set of human capacities that exist within each child, but all too often are not nurtured by the family or by the school. Essentially, what it means is a child's ability to manage their own affective life, their own emotions. Children who are strong in emotional intelligence have an ability to read another person's feelings. Children who don't have well-developed emotional intelligence, even though they may have high IQ, don't read well the social cues from other individuals. And this can become a real problem, if not in school, where the focus is on performance on tests, but in the real world. Okay? When a youngster is high in emotional intelligence, it predicts to positive relations with other children as they get older in adolescence, when they start thinking about dating, and as they move towards looking towards employment in the real world. Daniel Goleman, he was a professor from Harvard University, left academia and now has written a number of very popular books, has written perhaps the most readable book on emotional intelligence. So if this first principle that I'll be talking about for a couple of minutes resonates with you, either because you agree with it or you're wondering if maybe this is one area that you can help encourage your child, I would strongly recommend picking up Daniel Goleman's book. It's a paperback book. It's not expensive. It's a really, really well-written book that talks about the emotional thermostat within the youngster. What I found in my work as director of the Duke TIP program, again with very, very intellectually bright children who tested very well, were clearly very bright, is some of the youngsters didn't have real well-developed emotional intelligence or social skills. Three common problems that we saw on the campus of Duke University were youngsters very bright, but they were unable to read the nuances or subtleties of social interactions. in its most innocent form, these youngsters get ostracized. They don't make a lot of friends. In its worst form, they get teased, taunted, picked on, and bullied. It becomes a real problem as the child moves into adolescence. So that's one type. They're not able to read social situations. The second is they have actual skill deficits in emotional intelligence. They simply struggle learning appropriate social skills. Now, the child may be wonderful in terms of reading, may be fantastic in terms of figuring out mathematical problems, but they just seem to have some problems learning appropriate social skills. What does this mean for the family and the parents? This is something that we need to work on. Not only working on the homework assignments, but in the evening, on weekends, working on enhancing my daughter or my son's ability to learn appropriate skills. For example, and I'll give one example, and it may not apply as well in Singapore as it does in the United States, because everything, all of my experiences and everything I talk about is culturally based, of course. But as director of the Duke program, I would be out there and greeting every one of the 2,000 youngsters who came to the campus in the summer. That was one of my responsibilities, and I really enjoyed doing it. It was important to me in representing Duke when youngsters came. They either flew into campus, and we had youngsters from Asia and Australia and Africa and all over the United States, and then we'd have buses pick them up at the airport and bring them to campus, but also parents would drive their son or daughter to campus. So I made it my point to greet each and every of the youngsters who came to campus. So they got to meet the headmaster. I welcomed them, and I made eye contact with them and shared with them my enthusiasm with their coming to a great place to learn and to make friends and grow. And just in the 20 or 30 seconds interaction with each of those children, I was able to predict who had adequate emotional intelligence and who was going to have a problem on campus. These were all kids who were very, very bright. It was never an issue of whether they had enough intelligence to compete. They all were extraordinarily bright. But just in the few seconds where I put out my hand to shake their hand and make eye contact with them, I got a quick sample of whether this youngster was going to fit in with other youngsters, fit in with the teachers, fit in with the staff across campus, how well they were socially. And this was a predictor that really held up. Over the course of the summer, I would get reports that this child had problems in the dormitory, or wasn't getting along, or in group projects. And I would look at the name and go, yeah, I do remember 3 weeks ago when I met them, when the parents, they avoided eye contact. They were very awkward and uncomfortable saying hello. They didn't ask me how I was. They didn't say, really nice to meet you, Dr. Pfeiffer, I'm happy to be here. The kind of things that kids aren't born with. These are the skills that parents teach children. And the last are performance deficits. And what I mean by this is the child knows what to do socially, but doesn't demonstrate it. Okay? So skill deficits, they really don't know what to do in social or interpersonal situations. So to expect someone to be competent when they don't have that skill, impossible. But there are a group of children who know what to do, but for any number of different reasons don't demonstrate that social skill at the right time. Okay? Let me just point out with this slide that the important thing here is this notion of compassion. When I get to strengths of the heart, which are very important to me, and my most recent book focuses a lot on, in raising a child, what we want is harmony, or a marriage between strengths of the head and strengths of the heart. Compassion is really critical as we followed youngsters as they grow up to see whether they're going to be successful or not. Emotional intelligence is linked to the ability to be compassionate. So one of the things that I'm concerned about as a psychologist when I work with a family who comes to see me because their son or daughter are having behavior problems, or emotional problems or social problems at school or in the neighborhood that leads them to come to my office, is to get a sense or a reading, to do this thermostat, as Goldman talks about, regarding their emotional skills, because if they're lacking in that, they're going to be lacking in compassion. And that's a critically important, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, strength of the heart. So this is something that you want to pay attention to as a parent. Okay, so that's the first lesson I share with you, to pay attention to emotional intelligence and not just the academic intellectual. The second is promoting balance. What you want to do as a parent, and this is tricky, again, I'm digesting in a 40-minute talk lessons that really we could be spending hours on, and I recognize that, and I hope you appreciate in going over these 6 points that I'm just giving you a surface overview. This is a very subtle and nuanced point, this notion of balance. And every day as a parent, you make decisions that reflect in part the balance that you're showing in raising your child, your son or daughter. In my work, now in my career, I've focused for 35 years on high-ability youngsters, but what I'm talking about here applies to every child in every town, in every city across the globe. And that's that we have to be careful in encouraging the child academically and intellectually, which is very important indeed. We want to be cautious not to put undue focus and weight on their intellectual and academic development so that things are out of balance and that we're not giving enough time, we're not giving enough appreciation, we're not giving enough opportunity for the non-intellectual and non-academic development in spheres of their life that are also very important in terms of raising a child to become a successful adolescent and successful adult. So it's a matter of balance. We have this phrase in the West, you don't want to cut off your nose to spite your face. We clearly don't want to minimize the important role that parents play in encouraging their child's intellectual and academic development. Very important, as I'll talk about in terms of developing head strengths. But sometimes, some parents put excessive emphasis on this one area to the relative neglect of other areas that are also extremely important in ultimately raising a child who's going to be a successful adolescent or successful adult. So it's this notion of balance. A quick example from my clinical practice. Many years ago, I had a youngster who was brought to my practice who was a very bright student, very bright, but a world-class swimmer. Alex, and this is in one of my books. If you've read my book, my 2003 book, I talk about Alex. That's not his real name, but he was brought to me by his parents because his work in school took a precipitous drop, and he was showing signs of clinical depression. His father was a physician, happened to work in the medical center where I was working at the time, was very aware of clinical depression and was worried about his son, was worried about Alex. Alex was a world-class swimmer as a child. He had the third fastest 100-meter freestyle time in the world. So he was on a fast track to be something special in swimming. His parents were well-intentioned, loving, caring, smart, thoughtful parents. I was very fond of them. I knew the dad because he worked at this large medical center where I worked. And when I met the family, they were very lovely. No question about it. Their son was in trouble, and he was on a fast track to be a real mess. He was on a track where if we didn't intervene, he probably would have been quite depressed. He probably would have turned towards drugs and alcohol. He probably would have been asked to leave his school. He was in a highly competitive academic setting. Things just weren't going well for Alex, even though he was a very talented youngster who was extraordinarily gifted in swimming. Now, I could talk about other youngsters I've worked with who are gifted in different areas. The point of my bringing up Alex is that we want to look at gifts in multiple areas, not just the academic. But when I talk about Alex, you could think about it, it could be a youngster who's extraordinarily gifted academically, or in theater, or in dance, whatever it might be. Alex was extraordinarily gifted in swimming, and his parents were doing everything that had been encouraged for them to do to promote his swimming ability. So he was getting extra swimming lessons at the university by the university swim coach. This was in New Orleans. It happened to be the swim coach at Tulane University. He was spending many, many extra hours in the exercise facility at the college, even though he was only 11 years old or 12 at the time, with 17 and 18-year-olds working out, because that was what was important if he was going to stay on a trajectory of being a world-class swimmer. So his parents were well-intentioned, encouraging in every way that they could think of and that people had suggested to promote Alex's development. What they didn't realize that Alex was suffering because the balance was awry. And Alex was he was a lovely, very sweet, and very respectful youngster, and he was unwilling to tell his parents, "Mom, Dad, stop. Too much." He just wasn't able to do that. That was too difficult for him. He was raised in a way that he wasn't going to do that. But in counseling individually with me, he shared that, and he told me that I don't get to spend hardly any time with my friends. I don't have any downtime. I don't know if that's a term used here, but in America that's a term. And he said, I just don't have any time to unwind or relax. He said, and I know my parents are well-intentioned, and I'm not willing to tell them to stop because their heart is in it. And I know they get such gratification from seeing me perform at the meets. So what had started as something that he was very passionate about and incredibly good at was souring rather quickly, and yet he was unwilling to tell his parents. So counseling over a number of weeks helped Alex to be comfortable to actually share with his parents that he needed them to back off, that he needed some time away from swimming, time to focus on other things that were important in his life. Very positive outcome with Alex. His parents heard it. They were surprised. They had no idea that that's really what was lurking beneath the surface. All they knew was that their son was depressed, that his grades had gone down, he was moping around, and they couldn't figure out what it was about. So this wasn't a complex problem, but it was one that was difficult to get at. But once we got at it and the parents were able to adjust some of the priorities, they didn't take him out of the swimming pool, but one evening a week, they took him out of practicing with the college team, and he joined a church youth group with kids his age who weren't extraordinary swimmers. They were just normal kids who were 11 and 12 years old. Alex ended up getting a scholarship in swimming to college. He never made it to the Olympics. Didn't swim at that level, but he swam at college. He did wonderful, and he's now in medical school. He's doing very well. So he's an example of a successful child who probably, without intervention and counseling, without his parents being provided the insight to consider balance, probably never even would have graduated from high school. He was on that kind of trajectory. Now, these are well-meaning parents, loving parents, who thought they were doing absolutely the right thing, but things were a little out of balance. Okay, third principle. We want to encourage our children. We love them. We want the best for them. We want them to do well. We want them to be successful. But we need to be careful that sometimes in holding these values and expectations, we can push a little too hard, and the push becomes perceived by the child as a shove, and the nudge or encouragement sort of as a kick. And then the child loses the sense of what we call intrinsic motivation to do well. And they feel like they're now working for the parents, or working to avoid failure, or working to avoid the disappointment of their parents. And when that transition happens, you're in trouble. Because now the child has lost their love of doing well because they love the sense of mastery, which all infants and toddlers and preschoolers have. But for some youngsters, because we push too hard, we put too much pressure on grades, too much emphasis on not making mistakes, what started out as a desire for mastery, for accomplishment, an internal, heart-driven, intrinsic desire to do well, diminishes, and the child starts feeling like this erosion of the internal or intrinsic motivation has now been replaced by parents and others, teachers who are just pushing too hard. The related issue is not only pushing too hard, so we want to be careful, but encouraging or pushing too fast, wanting our children to grow up too quick. And this is sort of a pandemic globally, not just in Singapore. I see this in my travels wherever I go, that there are some parents, and I'm really not talking about all parents, and it may not relate to you sitting here, but there are some parents, again, well-intentioned, they love their son, they love their daughter. Not only are they pushing too hard, but they're rushing their child to grow up too quickly. So the related dual lesson here is encourage, provide opportunities for your child, be excited about their mastery of work, but don't push too hard, don't rush them too fast, don't unduly focus on their getting everything perfectly correct, or what we find is an erosion of the internal motivation, their loss of their passion for learning, and then what we're facing is a youngster who may not be successful in adolescence or young adult life. David Elkind, he's a psychologist in the United States, has written a wonderful, very, very readable book that I recommend to all the parents that I see in my clinical practice. And it's called The Hurried Child, Growing Up Too Fast, Too Soon. I'm not suggesting this is a book that you all rush out and buy and read. But if what I'm saying here with this principle resonates even a little bit, or maybe even you're thinking, maybe I could slip into a little too much pushing, hurrying my child too much, then this is a book that you want to read. It's really beautifully written, and I think it speaks with great insightfulness to the point of let's slow down and let children enjoy their childhood and being children. Okay, principle number 4. I mentioned that there were 4 things in my history that have influenced this talk tonight. All right, so 1 is I've been a psychologist for a number of years. 2 is I worked at Duke University with high-ability youngsters for a number of years, and that influenced my thinking. 3rd was I had the opportunity to work with elite young athletes. And the 4th, a parent. There is a 5th thing I didn't mention. I've forgotten I should mention. And that is that I was in the military for a number of years. So I was a psychologist and an officer in the military for 7 years. And that and being raised in a traditional conservative family clearly also has influenced my thinking. So if you don't like what I'm going to say here, you can just sort of disregard, I hope you don't, but disregard it. Well, yeah, he was in the military and he was raised in a traditional family. We don't buy that. But what I have found over my 35-year career, working with hundreds and hundreds of kids in trouble, and in working at Duke University with high-ability youngsters, some of whom get in trouble and don't end up being successful, and in raising my kids and some of the problems that they had growing up, although they turned out quite well, is that quite often, or too often, parents and families are reluctant to set clear rules and expectations and guidelines for what's appropriate behavior and what's inappropriate behavior. Too often, some parents, well-intentioned, loving, are uncomfortable or unwilling to say no, to tell a child to stop that behavior and explain why not. This is a rampant problem in the United States, and I can't speak, I've only been here 3 months, I really can't speak with any authority about Singapore, but in the United States and in Western countries, this is a problem that probably impacts 20 to 25% of the children growing up today in the 21st century. It's well-intentioned, loving parents for a variety of different philosophic reasons are unwilling to raise their child in a way that evidences clear discipline. It may be that they think that it's going to in some way thwart their child's creativity. It may be because they're uncomfortable feeling that they're going to be a disciplinarian or someone that their child doesn't see as a friend or buddy. And that is discussed with me quite often in my clinical practice when I see kids who are absolutely out of control in loving families, and when I talk to the parents about why they're unwilling to have the child sit down and hold the child until the child sits down, because a child that age should be able to sit quietly while we're talking, they say, because it really bothers me. I want my child to like me. I don't want to have to set a limit because then they're going to be angry with me, and that really bothers me. Well, that's an issue that if it's occurring in your family, you need to face, and you need to say, I probably need some assistance. Let me try by reading a book, talking to someone else, seeking professional consultation if the book doesn't help, because all children need limits. All children need to learn to abide by rules. Even the most brilliant children, to be successful in this world, need to recognize that they're part of the social fabric and that they can't go on where they're in charge of their world. Well, let me go back for a second. We're almost at the end of time, and I'm going to speed up a little, but let me just, this is something that came up. I talked to a group of parents a couple weeks ago in Singapore. I was invited through the Ministry of Education to give a talk, and there was a large group like this of parents, and one of the things came up, what can you do? What I advocate in one of my books are family meetings. And what a family meeting is where you're sitting down with your child and everyone has an opportunity and has to use the opportunity to talk about something of significance or relevance that's gone on in their life, that's gone on well, but maybe a problem. And when the child is talking, you have to listen, and then you come up with some problem solving when they talk about that issue. And one of the parents came up to me and said, but, you know, we really go to the Hawker Center, and it's kind of awkward. And so I've been going to the Hawker Centers, which I love, and I think you can even have wonderful family meetings at the Hawker Center. So this is sort of a cross-cultural recommendation to carve out time, and it might be once a week, where you have a family meeting. It goes for about 30 minutes. Dad has to talk about what's going on in work, and it might be an issue, and he talks about how he's working through it. Mom talks about a problem and how she's, and then each of the children have to talk about that. It teaches social intelligence, emotional intelligence, problem solving, and you may need to point out to your child, you need to figure out how to get over this if the teacher's upset with you. Here are some strategies. Okay, so family meetings work. Okay, let me go through 5 and 6 pretty quick because we're pretty much at our 40-minute time period. So the 5th recommendation or principle that I have and the 6th have to do with head strengths and heart strengths. These are both very important. You probably are very familiar with head strengths and perhaps not as focused on strengths of the heart. But as I said at the beginning of my talk, I believe very strongly that a marriage, a melding, a harmony of strengths of the head and strengths of the heart together predict towards a child growing up to be a successful adolescent or adult. So head strengths are the intellectual activities that you're focusing on, academics, creativity. What can parents do? Essentially model a love of learning. If in this August building, we want our children to read. Reading is perhaps the single most important predictor of academic success, even more than IQ. Well, parents demonstrating reading on weekends, talking about a book that they've read, be it fiction or nonfiction, discussing it at dinner, is what we talk about in terms of modeling the kind of behavior that we want for our children. Appropriate level of challenge and making learning enjoyable, encouraging the intrinsic passion a child has rather than external reinforcement. We want to be careful of not unduly focusing on the perfect grade, the perfect score. Kids need to learn that it's perfectly beautiful to make mistakes, that effort is more important than grade if ultimately they're going to be successful. It might not be at that particular test or class period, but ultimately in adolescence and college and in the real world, children need to grow up to be comfortable experimenting, taking intellectual risks, making mistakes. So we as parents need to talk about that and encourage that and not focus excessively on being perfect, being correct. And well, if we had more time, I would talk about flow. Let me just say that flow and flow theory is an interesting concept. Essentially, it speaks to one aspect of motivation, one aspect of intrinsic motivation, where you are so engaged in the activity that just about everything else around you is lost, including your sense of time, including who might be around you. We see it most vividly, most poignantly in sports when someone's in a flow state. And they're in a flow state just a short period of time. Most often it's hard work. But if we can help kids to understand and get a taste for the flow state, then they're going to work very, very hard for 85% of the time when you're not in a flow state to develop their head strengths. A quick example, since I came to Singapore, I was committed to improving my running ability. And I'm a runner, I've been running for years and years, but I had more time on my sabbatical, so I said, I'm going to just work out every day and just get my running down so that I'm a little more efficient. And after about 7 or 8 weeks of running every day, for the first time, and I was working very hard, and it was sort of grinding. And then about 7 weeks here in Singapore, all of a sudden I hit a flow state. I was about at maybe 6 laps into a 400-meter track, and I lost all sense of time. I stopped looking at my watch. I stopped looking at anyone else, and I was just in a beautiful flow state. I felt like sort of I was an animal just running, and I was just tuned into my breathing. There was no one else around me. It was a great feeling. And the next 3 to 4 laps, it ended up that I ran at a very fast pace, and it was wonderful. I then went out running the next day, and I didn't get into a flow state. It was back to the grind and the work, but having that taste of the flow state kept me going. And that's as true in academics and intellectual work and artistic work and dance and theater and drama and anything that your kids get involved as it is in academics. So if you can point this out and get them to realize if you work very hard, you will have a taste for this wonderful experience, it keeps kids going. Okay. And so, and the last lesson is developing heart strengths. And as I said, this harmony between strengths of the head, strengths of the heart, very, very important. What I call signature strengths of the heart. These are heart strengths that we have found in following children over many years, those that have been successful, those that have grown up and have not been successful. These are the signature heart strengths that are as important as developing your child's intellectual ability and creativity. Social responsibility, loyalty and teamwork, humility, playfulness, a sense of hope or optimism. There's a great book by Marty Seligman, a paperback book on the power of optimistic thinking and optimism. If your child is pessimistic and negative, get Seligman's paperback book. It's a great book with very concrete suggestions about what you can do as a parent to increase their sense of optimism. It's a very powerful heart strength. Persistence. There's a lot of research that shows that persistence and frustration tolerance are more important than IQ in ultimate success in adolescence. And there's a lot that parents can do in encouraging persistence, not giving up, sticking with something even if you're frustrated and it's not working out. And this starts very, very young when kids are playing on the kitchen floor when they're crawling before they're even walking. Honesty and integrity, obviously, critical heart strength. Enthusiasm. What we found in my new book, what I talk about is enthusiastic persistence. It's a beautiful marriage of two heart strengths. Okay? Enthusiastic persistence. Not only is the youngster persistent and sticks with it, but they're enthusiastic about it. That's a kid who's going to rule the world when they grow up, irrespective of their IQ or how they scored on tests. And kindness, very, very important. Okay. So the take-home points. Again, I said this is going to be a brief presentation just to whet your appetite, to give you something to think about before the question and answer. The take-up points. You as a parent can encourage your child's EI or emotional intelligence. As you support your child's development, heart strengths, head strengths, think about balance. You know, you and your husband, you and your wife want to talk about, are we pushing too hard, too fast? Set and enforce limits and rules. They change as a child grows up. Obviously, as the child gains more maturity and responsibility, you give them more freedom. No question about that. And this harmony or marriage between heart strengths and head strengths, very important to the ultimate success of your child, your son or daughter. So these are the 5 take-home points. Now we're about at that time for questions and answers. So,
Okay, now we are going into the Q&A session. Do take the opportunity to ask questions because Professor Pfeiffer is flying off in about a month's time. So any questions now you have, do ask.
Thanks very much for your guidance on this. Can you just share with us the age factor, At what point do you see that it can make a critical difference as opposed to, how early you should intervene with you? Okay, so, you didn't really cover the age group, but you gave us the impression that it's from preschool all the way to early. But can you just expand on that a little bit more for us?
Sure. Just about everything that I've said applies in a developmental model. So there are not like at age 5 do this, at age 7 that. It relates to your child's intellectual maturity and social maturity, and it should be a slow transition rather than abrupt qualitative transitional stages. And it varies child by child. If I had a year to meet each of you individually and you talk to me about your son or daughter, and if your son or daughter if they were all the same age, there's going to be variations for each child based on their intellectual maturity, their social maturity, and your comfort as a family. No two families set exactly or hold the same rules, expectations, or values, so there's going to be some variation based on what your comfort level. I come from, again, a family that was traditional conservative. In my experience, rules are important. So if my 3 children were here, they would stand up and shake your hand and thank you very much. But another family, that may not be as important, and that's fine. I mean, there's no one set of precepts that applies to all families, so it's going to vary based on where the family. But in general, for example, rules, limits, discipline are important, irrespective of whether you're a very liberal or a very conservative traditional family. But it may be more so for some families, such as mine, than other families.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting and useful. I'm very curious.
You're quite welcome, and wasn't that a good example of emotional intelligence operating? You're quite welcome.
Thank you. I like what you say about intrinsic motivation, because I keep asking myself, how do I get my child to be interested because he is interested, not because I'm getting him to do it? Because every time I ask him, go and do your homework, or if I ask him, do you want to do your homework? The answer is no, right? So how do I get him to, to make good choices for himself, and not because I'm forcing him to do it or cajoling him to do it?
Okay. It's a good question. There's no simple answer I can give. It starts, if any of you sitting here with just 3 or 4-year-olds, okay, a lot easier for you guys than it is for those of you who, how many 11, 12, or 13-year-olds? Okay, if you have that problem in your 11 or 12-year-old child, it's trickier than the child who hasn't yet entered. We know with very, very young children, they innately love discovery and to work on things until they can master it. And they'll do it over and over again, toddlers and preschoolers. Somewhere between that age and age 10 and above, it's now homework and I don't feel like doing it. So what we need to do from a preventive point of view for those parents who have very young children is to get out of the emphasis on the homework and to reinforce through family meetings, through discussion, the importance and love of discovery, of doing something well, of doing something that's exciting and encouraging that. And as the child matures, talking also that not everything is going to be fun or wonderful or something that you love. And there's a balance. And hopefully in school you'll be able to be exposed to a lot of things that you really get excited about, but not everything is going to be like that. And that's true in life, and you talk about that as a parent in terms of your own work. None of us have jobs where absolutely 100% of what we're expected to do is wonderful and fantastic. Hopefully the ratio is pretty good. And if it's terrible, we start considering maybe I need to be pursuing a job elsewhere. So what we need to do is teach the child that lesson from very young so that by the time they're 9 or 10 and they're given some inane assignments that they have no interest in, they understand that there's going to be some balance between that and things that they can get excited. And that question might be, well, what if they're in a school program where there's nothing? I hope that's not the case here in Singapore, and I can't comment, but in the United States, I say, well, then we need to problem solve. What can you at home do to supplement what's happening in school that your son or daughter can get really excited about? Maybe you can go on the internet and find some activities. Maybe you can take a course online. Maybe there's things you can do on the weekend to get your son or daughter real excited about what we saw when they were 4 or 5 years old. So there's trade-offs, but if we start very young, impressing upon them the point that life is not just a bowl of cherries and everything's going to be wonderful, there's going to be some trade-offs. They understand that.
Sorry, thank you, Professor. I have a question. After reading this Elkind's Hurried Child that you introduced, it kind of dawned on me that we tend to emphasize a lot on the child to do things fast, to the extent that they could have completed a job, but with a lot of mistakes, resulting in them having redo. How then can we change this attitude of the child, such that instead of focusing on finishing a task fast, to finish it within the time frame, but has to be done in the correct manner?
Again, and these are great questions and important ones. I don't have a simple answer, but the solution is over time having many, many conversations with your child from when they're very young, so that that very important attitude is conveyed in a loving way to your son or daughter, so they understand that just rushing through something is not the best way to go about challenges in life, and that you would give examples from your work and examples from things that you do at home and things through your own life experience to reinforce, so it's not just talking down to the child, but making meaningful that taking pride in what you do, and it's okay to revise and make mistakes. The process is more important than getting it done as quick as possible. And that's something that there's no one speech that's going to have an impact on a youngster. It's many, many, many times over dinner, weekends, opportunities to talk about it. So when you go to the library or you go to a museum and you look at a work and you read about what the artist did and you say, you know, in fact, this painting, which is amazing, took months. If the artist would have completed it in a week, probably wouldn't be hanging up here and we wouldn't be so touched by it. And you know, you pull the book down and read about Matisse and the amount of effort that went into it, so that the child is getting a lot of experience from you in a real way about that principle, because it's a really important one. I mean, it's a really important one.
Hello, Professor. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and you know, being a Singaporean, I've always tried to do the thing about pushing her for excellence. So I give her like questions that are a bit tougher. She's not in primary 1. And then she goes to school and she said, this is really boring. I learned all of this in K1. You know, I'm bored out of my brain. And then I see her making careless mistakes everywhere, like forgetting
making
careless mistakes. Forgetting a full stop, you know, writing capital letters when she shouldn't. And I don't know how to motivate her. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, you've asked a couple of things in there. I'm not sure you're asking to motivate her. I think what you're asking is, how do I change or correct so she doesn't make careless mistakes, which is different than motivation. So it's an important question, and I'm making this distinction because it's an important one for the audience. I can't speak specifically. I always say the caveat, I can't give specific suggestions to any one parent here because I don't know enough about your child or you, and you know, I'm going to say something, you're going to say, we tried that, it didn't work. So I've learned over the years not to do that. But your question has important general principles. How to get a child, if they're not passionate about doing work, is different from getting my son or daughter to complete something that they think is boring and they just need to get done with, and they make careless mistakes. Very, very different. Okay? And we just need to, as parents, recognize there are, as I said earlier, some things that they need to do that they don't have their heart in, and that's just part of life. But then there are other things that we want to encourage and flourish their passion about. And so I don't know enough about your particular situation, but if it clearly is material that's redundant, that's below their challenge level. We went very quickly through that slide about appropriate challenge. Then you just need to sit down and say, you know, sweetheart, there are some things in life you have to do that are boring. And there are some things that I have to do in life that are boring, and it's terrible, but hopefully there's some good stuff that are real appropriately challenging for you. I'm just going to need you to just be more careful. Is that okay? And hopefully it's that issue, so that there are other opportunities where she can get very excited about work that is at an appropriately challenging level. And that may not be your specific case with your daughter, but that's a general principle, I think, for raising all children.
I very much enjoyed your conversation
Great.
with all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have an article that was in the paper recently regarding the Ministry of Education's Gifted Education program. When I read it, I was quite startled by the last paragraph. I've lived in Singapore nearly 40 years, and I've taught here at several schools. I appreciate the country very much, or I wouldn't be here 40 years later. But this particular article surprised me last week. And it says, someone asked about the more self-directed independent program for those who have been identified as gifted versus a structured program for those who have not been identified. Would this have any relevance to do with success?
Would it?
You've been identified and then have a program which supposedly is going to produce self-directedness and independence, or whether you're structured. Does that, for the ultimate success of the students later on in life?
If I understand your question, I hope I do, I'll cut to the chase and get to the bottom line. Is I think much, not all, much of what I've seen in gifted education, I've only been here 3 months, so I'm talking much more from my experience in the United States, that's been designed for, quote, gifted, unquote, children, is very useful and very beneficial for many children, not just children who are, quote, gifted, unquote. And I put the quotes because I'm a writer, if you're familiar with my books, where I don't believe that there is anything such as giftedness that exists in reality. It's a term, it's a useful term that we come up with for a group of youngsters who have high ability, but it's not like you can in any way differentiate in or any real sense a child who's gifted from a child who's not. And it differs country by country that I travel. But there's a lot of very innovative pedagogical approaches in gifted education that we have found work very well in the regular classroom. So one of the, if we define giftedness as high IQ, and that, my understanding, is how Singapore defines it, then essentially the one pedagogical approach that makes sense for gifted children in Singapore, and that's different than how we define it in the United States, is that material be presented at a more accelerated rate and a more developmentally advanced. And those are the only two pedagogical approaches that make sense if we define giftedness as high IQ. I don't define it that way, but if you do, that makes an awful lot of sense. But a lot of the other exciting activities would work as well and excite children who don't qualify in your country as gifted. So if,
What is your definition of gifted?
this is where my publisher should come up and, you know, and pushing the cart with my books, and we could sell these for disc. If a child has high IQ, then I call them they're a child with a high IQ. Giftedness, I have two definitions. For the young child who we classify as gifted is a child who, in my mind, has uncanny potential to perform extraordinarily in adolescence and adult life when provided the right opportunities. It's always a prediction. Giftedness, I define for the adolescent and young adult, is very different. It's no longer a prediction. I no longer look at IQ. I look at how that child, that adolescent, is actually performing in the real world, in the arts, in theater, in athletics, in academics, in debate, whatever it might be. And those youngsters who are performing at a spectacular level compared to other children, adolescents of the same opportunity, we call gifted. And it can vary, and kids can move in and out of this categorization, just like athletes can be, and just like dancers and people in theater can. So that's how so for young children, IQ is a helpful and useful predictor of later performance, but it's just a predictor. As we move towards real life performance, we should move away from predictors and actually look at kids performing in the real world. So things like motivation, persistence, passion for a subject, maturity, those are the kind of things that are important ingredients in addition to ability when we get to adolescence and young adult life. IQ, no longer critically important. When I'm recruiting for my research lab, postdocs, I'm not looking at their IQ scores. I'm looking at what have you done in the last couple of years that distinguishes you from other bright young individuals so that you're going to be successful in my research lab. So we shift away from IQ, which is a predictor, to real-life performance. So that's how I define gifted.
I really enjoyed your talk.
Say that they correlate with one another. Okay? Distinctions might be, for example, any of your children who are given tests in school or tests for the gifted program are very heavily loaded with questions that are much more of intellectual and academic performance and not creativity. They're asked to solve problems, to memorize material where there's only one correct answer, and that's very important in life. When we think about creativity, however, although it's under this umbrella of a head strength, it's a very different cognitive process, and it has different requirements and different outputs. And I'm oversimplifying for sure, but we're looking at problems that are presented to the individual where there's more than one right answer. There could be multiple creative answers. Most work in schools put more of an emphasis on the one correct, and that's important, but they tend to not put as much emphasis on the creative or divergent kind of tasks. Now again, they're all under that one umbrella of head strengths as opposed to heart strengths. But schools, not only in Singapore but across the globe, tend to overemphasize the intellectual and academic and don't put as much emphasis on the creative.
Sorry, I have another question.
Now, this is a two-question woman, so this has got to be a really good question now. You're getting two here.
Okay, do you agree that people with high IQ tend to be emotionally less resilient, maybe because they just face fewer failures in life, especially in Singapore where it's such an academic environment. So early on in life, your experience is just academics, and if you have high IQ, you do better. And then later on, when you come out to work, you realize it's not about life is not all about scoring good grades, and then you start to fail because I have some personal experience with friends who have very high IQ and can't cope with the working world. Would you agree with that? And do you think it's something that can be taught to them? Can it be remedied by some nurture? I hope that's a good question.
Show of hands. Is that a good question? Okay. We got. I don't have enough actual information here in Singapore to authoritatively answer that question. It's a good question, but I don't have a scientific answer. I can voice an opinion, but I think I'm here more as an authority, and I don't have authoritative evidence. I can tell you in the United States, there is not a significant relationship between high IQ and low resilience. Okay? It doesn't mean that there are not some. Hi, you're not texting another question, are you? That's not fair. You asked me that. Now this is a good EI is to listen to me, okay? You asked the question, let me give you the answer. There are some very bright individuals with extraordinarily high IQs who might be lacking in resilience, but there are also many, many very bright high IQ individuals who are quite resilient. And there are some people with low IQ who are not very resilient, and some with low IQ who are incredibly resilient and cope very well. So I don't think it would be fair to say that these extraordinarily high IQ kids, because of the way they've been socialized, are less resilient. I think resilience is a very beautiful, important concept. As parents, we want to think about how can we encourage resilience, how can we teach our sons and daughters to cope, because life has difficulties. There are bumps in the road, there are tragedies. None of us escape the existential conflicts that we're going to deal with in our kids. I think in general, people who are brighter, when provided the right opportunities, when experiencing failure, disappointment, and the parents deal with it not by freaking out and yelling at the child and showing non-verbally, I'm disappointed you didn't, but say, that's okay. What did you learn from it? What was the lesson learned when you failed? That builds resilience. And when kids are very bright and have that kind of family nurturing them, they have the advantage of really becoming even more resilient. Okay?
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for your time. I'm from Florida too, so go Knowles. My question is, what's your take on early childhood education? I like your point about not pushing too hard, and then I like the traditional steps that you had where in the past kids weren't putting in school at 2 years old, and I'm coming from the perspective of a parent of a 4-year-old, and she's just about to go into BPK in Florida and seeing the difference here in Singapore in their educational system. And I'm wondering what your opinion would be as far as how many hours per day is beneficial for a child and how much is too much. Like pushing too hard, like a 10-hour, 8-hour preschool day, which is what I see very common.
Well, that's definitely excessive, I would say. In general, I find that early childhood education is very helpful. And I haven't seen any research, and I'm not familiar in the many years I've worked with families with any family that has come to me where I've had a first-hand experience as a professional where early childhood education has had a negative impact on the child. I think, remember my principles, balance. So I think as a family, you decide what's reasonable for my son or daughter, given some moms might want to spend a lot of time with the child. So then maybe a half day or a couple hours. Another mom might have a job where she gets tremendous gratification from that position. And she might say, that's really important to me, so it makes more sense for my son or daughter to spend more time in daycare or preschool so that the quality time I have with my daughter is going to be real high quality because I feel great in my job. So it varies by family. But in general, in answer to your question, I think early childhood education is a very helpful intervention. We know for sure that in the first 7 to 8 years, there's more brain development occurring than at any other time. So we don't want to push too hard, but we want to provide learning opportunities. A lot of children get a lot of intellectual stimulation in the home, and that's wonderful. But for some families, it's difficult to provide that kind of stimulation, that kind of social interaction with other children, and then daycare and preschools really work very well. So I think you want to customize it by family, but in general, I've never seen any negative impact of early childhood education.
Professor Pfeiffer, I heard your interview on the radio some weeks ago, and something that you said intrigued me enough to come to the talk tonight. I think you said something about in your research among 2- or 3-year-olds that there was a difference, or there was a varying amount of giftedness and talent among 2 or 3 years old, and that's fine, I can accept that. But you also mentioned something about by age 9 or 10 that some would be able to catch up. I'm not sure if I heard you wrongly, but if you could just elaborate that or correct me if I heard you wrongly. The reason why I'm asking this is because I have a 3-year-old daughter, and she has a cousin who's about the same age as her, but whose linguistic skills is a lot better than hers. And I'm wondering whether, just based on what I heard you say, that hopefully she should be able to catch up in the next 7 years or so by the time she gets to 10. If not, is that going to be, is she going to be always behind her peers?
Okay. This is a gentleman commenting on an interview I had, I guess it was last week, on radio station here in Singapore. Again, I'm going to offer the caveat that I'm not going to speak specifically to your child's situation. I don't know enough about it, but I'll talk in a more general sense about this notion of developmental trajectories and what I think you're talking about, what I said during the radio interview. And the interviewer asked me, are kids born gifted or not? And what I said is, my belief is no. And as you heard me say before, I don't believe giftedness is something real. What I did say is that, and we've done some pretty interesting studies going into the nursery and the hospitals, kids vary from the first few days in some important behavioral characteristics, what we call behavioral tendencies or temperament. And these we've followed up for 7 or 8 years, and they tend to hold. And what I did say, I remember during the radio interview, is that they have studies now showing that even the neurological wiring of children varies very early on. So there are differences in abilities early on. But what I did say is that the environment plays an extraordinarily important role, even prenatally, before the child is born, and clearly after the child is born, in terms of what the family and the parents can provide for the child. That doesn't negate that there are differences in children. If each of you talked to me, if we had enough time, about your son or daughter and what they were like in the first 6 months, we would find some characteristic tendencies that still hold for the children. And some kids are born neurologically to be more intellectually advanced than others. And that we do know. And we know that probably we've done some research starting at about age 4 or 5 and tracking kids for 6 years. That said, there's a lot of shifting that goes on. When we talk about research, and those of you who are not sort of researchers, a lot of what you read in the newspaper, they're conclusive findings, but they're based on populations of studies, and there are a lot of individual differences. So even though the trends may be in general that kids at age 4 or 5 who test in a certain way in general can be predicted to score higher, say at age 10 or 11, 12, there are many, 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 many kids who shift and don't continue on that trajectory of success. And I said on the radio station, there are also children who early on didn't test very well and astound us later on with their extraordinary accomplishments. And that's what we call late bloomers. And there's just so much that has been written in the public literature as well in the scientific literature about late bloomers. And there's a lot written about children who do astounding things at an early age and fizzle out early, and don't do anything extraordinary in adolescence or adults. So there's a lot of room for shifting the environment, stimulation, the motivation, the things that we talked about here play a key role in supporting your child's development. So that's exciting. It's a very positive sort of finding where we are in 2012 and knowing that it's not things set at birth and that's where the child's going to be. There's a tremendous room for encouraging the development of the youngster.
Hi, Prof. Thank you for the speech. I enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
The question is, as a parent, I struggle to actually, how should I put it? Okay, not to focus so much on the academic results of my son. So how do we as parents move away from this and then, move towards we know his interest, and then how do we actually shift our attention? Because it's like, for me, it's like, this, how should I, it's like after the test and then you have the results. Although you say he tried his best, but for us as parents, we always feel that, no, you didn't do your best. You try to push him to get a better grade. Because it's like in Singapore context, academics is like so top priority that all the kids here really, tuition after tuition. And how do we shift our attention away from this? I believe a lot of parents face a lot of stress right now, in the Singapore context. So how do we actually, as parents, try to let go and then, move towards a more, like you said, balanced approach? Thank you.
It's not easy. There's a lot of pressure here in Singapore at an early age on the child's performance, so I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. And, one of the things you learn as a parent, and all of you as parents have learned, is that you can control certain things in life, but there's an awful lot that you can't control. And what we do is we help our children to cope effectively, given that the world may not be the most fair place and that there's some challenges that we're not going to be able to change. It speaks to resilience and effective coping. That said, what I tell parents who come to my practice and ask me the question you've asked is, I ask them to describe for me, and I was talking about this before the talk with one of the staff of the National Library, that I give them a list of adjectives, the parents, and I say, go over these and talk to me about what's most important now in the classroom for your son or daughter, and they circle certain adjectives. I say, okay, so now you're 9 or 10-year-old, these are the things that are most important. And it's easy for us to get caught up in, well, this is incredibly important if I want my child to be successful. I said, but let's step back for a second, and now I want you to think about your preschool, your 8-year-old, your 10 or 11-year-old. Think about them when they're 24, 25 years old. At least that's what I use in the United States of America as an example. I might modify it here in Singapore. I say, so your child has finished college and come home. What do you want if you go to graduation, your son or daughter's professor to say about your son or daughter when you meet them at graduation? When your son or daughter comes home for a holiday, what do you want your neighbors to say when they see your son or daughter and now he or she has their first job? Essentially, stepping back from our incredibly crazy focus on at age 9, 10, or 11 test scores, ultimately, what's the big picture? What do we want as parents for our children when they grow up and they are launched from our family and they start their own family and become adults? And sometimes that long view helps to minimize some of the pressure and the angst that we experience because we can't control the world in terms of getting caught up with what's going on in the present moment with our 9, 10, or 11-year-old. Or I get consultations in New York City where there's tremendous pressure among parents of 4-year-olds to get their kids into the right private school. And they'll spend any amount of money for me to test their child and verify that their child is of a certain intelligence so they can get into these schools. And, you know, I meet with these parents, and I mean, they are, again, they're well-meaning, loving, caring parents who just see my child's life is going to be over if they don't, at age 4 or 5, get into this school. And, you know, we start, again, having that conversation. Okay, we'll talk about that, but let's first talk about at age 24, 25, you know, what do we want your daughter or your son to look like and be doing, and what's most important? And a lot of these heart strengths then become the parents start talking about. So at age 4 or 5, they're always talking about the head strengths and the test scores. But when we start talking about 24, 25, I want my child, when she's grown up, to be compassionate and caring. I'd like her to have children also and be a loving parent. So, okay, well, we're not talking about test scores now. These are kind of important things. Let's sort of focus. Those are things that we can work on.
Hi, Prof. Pfeiffer. I just wanted to ask, I want to do a 2-questioner as well. You spoke about the importance of challenge, and I guess in a sense setting up that zone of proximal development for a child to have these opportunities to actually develop those areas of giftedness, so to speak. I was just wondering, what then are the signs of a parent pushing too hard in setting up that challenge? Are there clear clinical signs, so to speak, where you know you are already pushing too hard? Because you did talk about balance, but maybe you could shed some light on what are some of the symptoms that a child might display if we are pushing too hard. Is there also a danger that sometimes parents are almost competing with schools in their homes, like trying to out-teach their kids in their own homes, and then creating a problem where the child is actually not more gifted, they're just more bored? So is that something that parents should consciously avoid? And then a third question. 3 questions.
3 questions from one person.
A trifecta, yeah. You mentioned about giftedness in many areas.
Okay.
I was just wondering then, you know, that means providing opportunities for a child to discover a myriad areas of giftedness, so to speak. Now, how should parents actually go about doing this? You have limited time, especially in Singapore, you know, kids spend so much time in school. What kinds of exposure should we then give our children so that they do have those opportunities to discover other areas of excellence other than the academic? And with limited time, how do we maximize that ability to discover those areas of giftedness? When is the time for us to say, you know, you tried this, it's not really working, let's just pull out? But how do we then again balance between giving them sufficient time and exposure, and at the same time pulling out too early and hence discouraging perseverance, which you did say was a very important trait as well?
Those are 3 really good questions. If I asked you if I can only answer one, which would you want me to answer? Well, let's start with the second one. Yes. Parents can get excessively over-involved and compete with the schools in doing the work that the schools are doing. So that's absolutely a risk. So I think as a parent, you want to proceed cautiously, proceed in a very reflective and thoughtful manner in assessing whether your son or daughter is being provided what would be considered an appropriately challenging education before you add to what they're being exposed to. I tend to believe that there's a lot that children need to be provided in addition to academic and intellectual challenges. So if the school is doing a pretty good job, then there's important social and recreational and spiritual and volunteer activities to encourage the whole child that fit in with strengths of the heart. If you're duplicating and reinforcing what's going on or supplementing to an excessive amount what's being covered in the school, then you're putting too much weight on head strengths. But it depends on the school. There are some schools in the United States, and I don't know enough about Singapore, that are poverty areas where the schools are quite poor, and parents are justifiably concerned that their child's not nearly being provided enough challenge, and in that instance, the parents might be quite appropriate. But there are also a lot of good schools, and parents need to assess whether it's reasonable what's being provided so that they don't excessively push too hard. The first question is a really good one about how do you know. And let me use by analogy a sports example, because as I said, my experiences are based on my own life, and I spent a lot of time with my younger daughter as she was developing into a competitive soccer player. I think it's very obvious as a parent, because you know your child well, when you're pushing too hard. It's sort of what we call in science, I think it's called interocular occlusion. Are there any ophthalmologists here? Any ophthalmologists? Okay, interocular occlusion is a term for, it's so obvious it hits you between the eyes. It's sort of an American joke. You got to laugh a little. It's a funny joke. Come on. In sports, when we see someone who's passionate about the sport, and now that I've been on the campus of NTU, I watch competitive badminton. It's a wonderful sport. We don't play it in the United States, competitive. And I watch these college students play it, and they're passionate about it. They love it. And they're out there for hours and, refining their work. They have intrinsic motivation. They're driven by a love of the sport and a sense of mastery and doing well and improving. And they have moments where they're in the flow state. Okay? If their coach or parent is pushing too hard, and after the game or practice, let's go and do some weights, and the child starts backing off and now doesn't have the smile on their face, doesn't have the light in their eyes, then you obviously know as a coach or a parent, it's no longer the intrinsic motivation that's driving this athlete or my child, my son or daughter. That's then a clue. I better consider putting on the brakes, because I'm going to lose that internal drive, and it's only through external reinforcement that's going to keep them going. So you need to back off, or at least consider the time. And brilliant coaches know when to back off when they're pushing too hard, and parents as well. You know your kids. You look at when they now find it that it's a drudgery working on it. That's a time to back off. So you look at their face, you look at their facial muscles, you look in their eyes, and you know when they're excited about something versus when they're only doing it because you are the authority figure. Then you're at the potential of trouble. And I can't remember your third question.
I know what you're saying, but it could also be a situation where the child has not been sufficiently disciplined to have a sufficient level of mastery.
Oh, right.
So when do you know how do you tell the fine line between a child being lazy and not having sufficient mastery to enjoy it and losing the passion?
Well, passion can wax and wane and shift. My experience as a parent raising 3 children who are now adults and working with hundreds of families is once you identify something that your son or daughter might be real interested in, and this relates to your third question, and you expose them to choices, you ask them, select one. It might be taking an art class. It might be taking taekwondo. It might be doing some service learning with the church or the temple, whatever it might be. But you need to stick with it for a certain period of time and give it enough opportunity to get some sense of whether it's gratifying, meaningful, whether they have a taste for flow. You can't drop out or stop until you complete the contract, the agreed upon time. It might be 8 weeks, 10 sessions, whatever it might be. At the end of that time, you sit down and reassess it. And your child might say, I thought I liked yoga, or I thought I liked badminton, or I thought I was going to like this science online program, but I don't like it. And then you say, okay, I had hoped you'd like it because I'm an astronomer and I was hoping you'd grow up to be an astronomer, but you gave it a fair shake, and we're going to move on to something else. And now we're going to sit down and show you the different kind of things that you can sample as well. It's as much an art as a science, but I think it's real important that we give children the responsibility for making choices, and then we make sure they stick through it. But if it doesn't work out, then we expose them as parents to other opportunities and ask them, you need to at least engage in one thing, and let's see if you get a taste for this and like that. I work with a lot of families where kids have gotten into music and put, musical instrument, and some have played it for 8 years and gone on to do extraordinary things. Some, they didn't find careers in music, but they still play the violin or the piano, and it's very soothing for them. And then other kids, you make predictions, and after 6 months, I don't want to touch the guitar or the violin, and that's fine. As a parent, that may bother you because you have the piano in the living room and you play piano and your wife does, but your son or daughter has made that choice. And you may feel, I really think my son's making a bad decision, but it's their life, not yours, and you live with it. And it may be at age 30, they look back and go, I wish I would have stayed with the piano. You say, yeah, well, you learned from that. Now moving forward, what kind of decision can you make? In terms of the third question, though, you look in terms of, you said, gifted areas. I think you look in Singapore, what is the array of possible vocational opportunities for my daughter or my son? And then you talk with them about that. There's jobs as pharmacists, as salesmen, as mechanics, as engineers, as carpenters, whatever it might be. And then expose them to what those are like, and then provide opportunities for your son or daughter to get a taste for what that might be. There's a lot of exciting vocational fields where you don't just have to get A's in school.
Is getting late, and due to the constraints of time, we can only take one more question. Maybe only from this side. Let them have a chance to see this face. Yeah. Answer?
Professor Pfeiffer, thanks so much. I want to check with you in the course of work. You actually study temperaments.
Slow down. Just speak a little slower. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do you actually, in the course of your work, do you actually study temperaments of your clients? Temperaments as in melancholy, choleric, sanguine, Because different temperaments apparently have different traits and. For example, my course of work as a teacher, I find that those kids who belong to this temperament of phlegmatic, they need to be pushed a bit harder. Because, basically they're a very happy-going, lucky type. They need a guideline in how to push it harder. But kids born with a melancholic temperament, they are natural motivators. They are motivated in doing work on their own. I do not push them. In fact, many times I tell them to go slow, to relax. I don't know about, in your course of work, you actually study the temperament of this, the kinds and how they are related to this topic of giftedness.
Okay. That's a good wrap-up question. I happen to be a strong believer in individual differences. Okay, I'm an author of a test that measures different types of giftedness, and I committed 3 years to developing this test because I believe that there are individual differences among humans. So I am fully in agreement with what you're suggesting, that children differ in a whole range of behavioral characteristics and attitudinal approaches as well as abilities. No question about that. Absolutely. And my 3 kids differ in a lot of different ways. Personality characteristics and interests and things like that. Absolutely. So children do vary, some in subtle ways and some in not so subtle ways. And teachers need to be sensitive to that as well. So I agree with you completely. Where I might just make a slight modification in what you said, and we'll conclude with that because I think it's an important point, is I don't think we should push any kids. I don't think we should push any adults. And I'm just using that, I'm using this as an example of a word, and it may be different in Asian terminology than in American, but I think we want to encourage and nurture and support and provide opportunities. But I just think, and I know you weren't meaning that, but there's a subtle but important distinction. When we push our kids, I mean, do any of you, would any of you like to be pushed tonight? I mean, it doesn't feel good to be pushed. But it does feel good when someone cares about you, when someone loves you, when they encourage you and provide you with opportunities. And some kids need more encouragement. Some kids need, and I'm going to close with this. I really don't want to go back. No, excuse me. No,
push, but I mean, setting a deadline.
And again, I didn't want to get. I don't want to get into a debate on this. I just want to close. So try to understand my point. I'm not speaking to your situation. It's just encouragement and nurturance, I think, is important. But in my experience with high ability children, I can only speak with my experience, there are some parents who end up pushing out of an expectation. And I think that for some children that can backfire. For some, they're very resilient and they accept the push. It may be in leaving here later tonight. Some of you may forget your good emotional intelligence and push me in the elevator, and I'll have to accept that. And hopefully I'm resilient and I cope well and I'll understand you're in a hurry. But I'd rather not be pushed. So the point is, it's a subtle one, but I think it's an important one. But you're absolutely right, there are individual differences, and some children need a lot more work in a family than other children. So I agree with that point.
Yeah, thank you. We apologize for not being able to take all your questions. You have been a great audience. It's not often that we have so many questions coming, in Singapore. So please take some time to fill up the feedback form and leave them on your chair, especially with future topics that you'd like to see here at NLB. Okay, thank you, and let's give a hand once again.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Good luck to all of you. You are venturing on the most important, the most exciting, and the most meaningful journey possible in raising a child. So good luck to all of you. It's really a wonderful, wonderful God-given experience.